London's early morning drizzle painted the city in a shade of grey that blurred its outlines, as though the city itself was unsure of the truth. At precisely 5:42 a.m., a constable discovered the body of Julian Maddox, a renowned portrait artist, lying dead in his studio on Fleet Street. The door had been locked from the inside. The window was latched. No sign of forced entry. No sign of struggle. Just a man lifeless, eyes wide open, clutching a paintbrush as if still finishing his final stroke. Inspector Lestrade stood in the studio's center, perplexed by the lack of blood. Maddox had been stabbed cleanly in the heart with a thin, curved blade, a letter opener, perhaps, but no such weapon was found. The studio was unusually tidy for a murder scene, easel upright, paints aligned, turpentine capped. Only one thing broke the near-surgical order of the space, a half-finished portrait on the easel. It was of a man mid-30s, sharp cheekbones, a subtle sneer tugging his lips. The painting, although incomplete, was unnervingly lifelike, capturing a shadowed menace that unsettled even the most hardened officers. No one in the building recognized the subject. No fingerprints, no clue to his identity. A signature was scrawled across the bottom in wet paint, not by the artist, but by someone else. A single word, confess. The landlady, Mrs. Alderbridge, swore that no one had entered or left the building all night. She herself had locked the front door and kept the keys under her pillow. The windows in the hallway were bolted shut. No sign of tampering, and Maddox, he was known to be a recluse. In recent months, refusing commissions, hardly socializing. He had no known enemies. I've never seen the like. Lestrade muttered that same morning at 2-1 the Baker Street, holding the photograph of the painting up to the firelight. No exit, no weapon, no motive. And then there's this painting, devilish-looking fellow. We had it examined. That signature wasn't Maddox's. Holmes took the photograph in his long fingers, studying it with narrowed eyes. The brushwork here, see how the edge of the coat bleeds into the background. That wasn't Maddox's technique. This section was painted by someone else, just recently, possibly post-mortem. Watson, frowning, leaned closer. You mean to say the killer stayed to finish the portrait, or began it? Holmes said. Softly, the man in the portrait is likely our murderer. The signature is a taunt. A signature in an unfinished portrait, especially one so meticulously crafted, is a declaration. He wanted it to be found. The rain had stopped by the time Holmes and Watson reached Maddox's studio. The atmosphere inside was still thick. With turpentine and silence, Holmes moved with purpose, examining the worktable, brushes, discarded palettes. He ran his fingers over the edge of the easel, then knelt by the stool. He used Maddox's own materials, he said after a long pause. But the angle of the strokes, the brush, was held by someone left-handed. Maddox was right-handed, as evidenced by the callus on his index finger. Also, note the palette knife cleaned recently. Someone wiped it carefully. Not a single smudge of blood, though. Watson examined the floor. There are no second footprints, just Maddox's. Therein lies the puzzle, Holmes muttered. He stood abruptly and walked to the locked window. Tell me, Watson, why does a man paint his killer? sign the work with a name not his own, then die clutching a brush rather than cry out? Watson had no answer. The clue came not from the scene, but from Maddox's past. Holmes unearthed it that evening after scanning the archives at the Royal Academy. Years ago, Maddox had taken on a protege, one Elias Venn, a gifted but unstable painter expelled after a series of disturbing works. Venn had a history of psychotic breaks. Convinced his subjects were imprisoned in his art, he believed painting someone gave him power over them. His last exhibition, Holmes read aloud, was titled The Faces of Guilt. Each painting depicted a man with their sins carved into the strokes. One was a thief, one a liar. The final piece was titled Confess. It was withdrawn before the show opened. Venn vanished that same month. Watson stiffened. You think he's back? Holmes didn't answer immediately. He turned the portrait photograph over in his hand. I think he never left. I think Maddox tried to help him once. Perhaps Elias came back for a final lesson, one that involved death and legacy. They returned to the studio once more after nightfall, this time with permission to access Maddox's private sketchbooks. In the last pages was a study pencil sketches of a face, growing more agitated, more detailed with each drawing. The subject was the same man from the portrait. In the margins, scribbled in panic, he insists I paint him. He says only then will he be free. Madness. Lestrade muttered when shown the journal. Not madness, Holmes replied. Obsession. The studio was examined again, this time with Holmes's full attention. He traced the ventilation grate behind the easel. Inside, he found faint smears of red knot blood, but paint. The metal had been shifted recently to narrow for a man to enter, Watson observed. Correct, Holmes replied, but enough. For the edge of a poisoned weapon, inserted through the grate. Maddox sat here, painting, unaware. The killer needn't be in the room. He painted the likeness from memory, slipped the blade in from behind while Maddox was transfixed, and then Lestrade asked. Then he waited. Perhaps Maddox never even realized he was stabbed. He simply stopped. The killer entered later, maybe with a key, maybe with Maddox's trust, and signed the portrait, finishing it. He wanted the world to see it, but Holmes's theory demanded proof, and it came unexpectedly from turpentine. Holmes traced a distinct chemical variation in the solvent used in the top layers of the portrait, an unusual mix not sold in London, but imported by a private supplier. Only one recent order matched the chemical profile. The buyer's name, Elias Venn. Address in Wapping. The arrest came at dawn. Venn, gaunt and wild-eyed, was found in a room lit only by candles, surrounded by portraits. Each face bore an accusation: liar, thief, betrayer. When confronted with Maddox's death, he smiled. He was the last. Venn whispered, I painted the truth into them. I set them free. Holmes said nothing. He turned to leave as Venn's laughter echoed down the narrow stairwell. He had painted his confession in oil and madness, and Julian Maddox had been his final canvas. Sherlock Holmes sat in silence as their cab rattled away from Wapping, the muffled clop of hooves echoing through the damp London streets. Beside him, Watson glanced at the detective's unreadable profile. The soft halo of morning mist giving Holmes's sharp features a ghostly edge. "You don't believe it's over," Watson said finally. Holmes blinked, as if surfacing from deep thought. "No, Elias Venn is clearly unstable. Brilliant in his own disturbed way. But he's not the true artist of that murder. He is a signature on someone else's canvas." "But he confessed." "He performed a confession," Holmes corrected, "and no one asked why. Why would a man so obsessed with symbolism and meaning insert a blade unseen? Rather than revel in the act itself, Venn is not a man who hides. He is a man who wants to be understood. The murder was silent, bloodless, efficient, cold, not his style at all." As they neared Baker Street, Holmes leaned forward suddenly. "And another thing, where was the weapon? You believe someone else retrieved it. I believe someone else left with it. Someone Venn trusted, or feared." They returned to Maddox's studio that afternoon, despite Lestrade's assertion that the case was closed. The inspector had reluctantly granted access, muttering about Holmes's tireless flair for reopening wounds that Scotland Yard preferred to consider stitched. The room had not changed, but Holmes's gaze was new. He moved through it like a conductor preparing a symphony, running his fingertips along surfaces, sniffing the air, crouching suddenly beside the coal grate. Watson, ever the observer, watched him pause by the discarded sketchbooks once more. "You've seen those already," Watson said. "True," Holmes murmured, flipping rapidly through the pages. "But not with the knowledge that something's missing." He stopped. "Yes, here. Notice this tear pages cleanly removed, several sheets, and recently, by the look of it." Why tear out sketches? Because they weren't sketches. They were letters, or perhaps a journal. Holmes rose, face darkening. Maddox was chronicling something or someone, and that someone didn't want the words surviving him. The landlady, Mrs. Alderbridge, was brought in again for questioning. A grey bun sat sternly atop her head like a crown of thorns. She had the unnerving calm of a woman who found even tragedy predictable. No one entered. "Mr. Holmes, I swear it, Julian rarely had visitors. You mentioned before that he hadn't been taking commissions recently." "No, but there was one exception." Her tone faltered. "A gentleman, well-dressed, came to, maybe 3 times in the past month. Always late, always stayed no more than half an hour. Polite, quiet. I never caught his name." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did he ever speak with you?" "No," she said. "Though the second time, he left behind a pair of gloves on the banister. Black leather. I remember because he came back the next day to fetch them. Seemed rather anxious about it. Do you still have them?" "No," she replied regretfully. "He took them." But Holmes's attention had drifted. He stepped past her and knelt by the base of the stairs. "This banister?" he asked. "Here." "Yes, that's right." He ran his hand along the wood. "Freshly oiled. Within the last few days. Odd. Time for maintenance." "I didn't touch it," she insisted. "Then someone else did. Likely to remove something." Holmes rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Alderbridge, do you own a dog?" "Certainly not. Yet I smell." Faint traces of animal fur, recently disturbed, and see here on the carpet. He pointed to a fine, reddish strand clinging to the edge of the stair runner. Fox terrier. I would wager Maddox hated animals, if I recall. Allergic. He once refused to paint a man's portrait because he brought in a spaniel. Watson frowned. So either Maddox had changed, or he didn't invite the guest. Precisely, Holmes said. Let us find out whose dog made it in here. At Holmes's request, Lestrade put in an inquiry with the local kennel register purely to humor him, he claimed, but within hours they had a match. A Mr. Francis Ainsley, art dealer and patron of the Royal Academy, owned a fox terrier and had recently written to Maddox regarding a private commission of great sensitivity. He claimed the artist had turned him down. He lies, Holmes said flatly. Let's pay him a visit. Ainsley lived in a grand terrace house in South Kensington. The man who greeted them was elegant in appearance, but carried a tremor in his voice and hands. Holmes's eyes never left him. I told the police everything, Ainsley said quickly. I inquired about a portrait, but Maddox refused. I never met him. You sent letters? Yes, 4 or 5, but no reply. Yet your dog left its mark on his stairwell, Holmes said gently, and your gloves were seen. Ainsley's mouth twitched. I may have exaggerated my distance. Holmes leaned in. You visited Maddox. We know. That, in itself, is not a crime. But you see there is a signature on the painting. A word. Confess. And we will uncover what it was meant to expose. Ainsley's hands clenched. I didn't kill him, he said. I was there the night before he died. I left. He was alive. I swear it. Who else was there? No one. He was alone. Holmes took a step closer. Did you touch anything while you were there? A pause. I held the palette. And you took something from the sketchbook. Ainsley's eyes widened. Holmes sighed. Mr. Ainsley, I believe Maddox discovered something about you something you could not afford to have known. Perhaps blackmail was involved. Perhaps not. But you didn't kill him. Your hands aren't steady enough to paint that signature. Ainsley crumbled into a chair. I'm being ruined. I was forged, years ago, in a deal with Venn. I sold fakes in Maddox's name. He found out. He said he would go public. I begged him not to. He refused. You brought Venn to him. I didn't know Venn would. I just thought Maddox would see the man he'd betrayed. That's all. Just see him. Venn was calm. To calm. Watson exhaled sharply. You let the fox into the henhouse, but Holmes looked grim, and Venn had no intention of leaving quietly. The web was growing tighter. Venn had returned, but not alone. Ainsley's desperation had pulled the strings. Yet someone else had painted that signature. Someone steady, precise, and still unaccounted for. Holmes stood. One more thread remains. He murmured. Venn was the madness. Ainsley was the motive. But someone wielded the blade. And the final portrait had yet to reveal its darkest brushstroke. The next morning brought a brittle chill to London, the sort that crept through seams and settled in the bones. Holmes, however, appeared impervious to the cold as he stood at the window of 221B Baker Street, watching the traffic with absent eyes. He had barely slept. The pieces of the puzzle, Ven's madness, Ainsley's desperation, Maddox's isolation hung like portraits in his mind, each frame incomplete. He turned. Abruptly, "Watson, we must speak to those closest to Maddox, his mortals, his rivals, even his suppliers. Somewhere among them is a voice out of tune." Watson was already pulling on his coat. "And what of Ven? He speaks in riddles and shadows. We shall return to him, but first, I want to hear those who claim to speak plainly." Their first stop was the studio of Camilla Hartright, a former student of Maddox and a rising star in the art world. Her reputation had outpaced her years, though whispers of envy toward Maddox's legacy were not uncommon in artistic circles. She received them in her conservatory, light pouring through stained glass. Her eyes guarded yet eager. "I adored Julian," she said with precision. "He was my mentor, and at times, more than that, I owe my technique to his guidance." Holmes nodded faintly, studying the curve of her brushwork on a half-finished canvas. "You last saw him when? 3 weeks ago," she replied without hesitation. "We had tea. He spoke of ending his career, said he wanted to disappear into anonymity. Let the world forget him." "Odd," Holmes said. "His final works suggest otherwise." He was painting with renewed intensity. She hesitated. "Yes, that part confuses me. I assumed he was struggling." His letters were erratic, distant. Holmes arched a brow. "Letters? May I see them?" Camilla hesitated again before unlocking a drawer and producing 3 envelopes. Holmes read them carefully. They were in Maddox's hand, urgent but vague, speaking of unfinished work, of a face that would expose the rest. Yet in one letter, dated 2 days before his death, the ink bore an unusual hue. Holmes held it to the light. "This isn't Maddox's ink. See the variation in pigment density? This was written by someone mimicking his style. And poorly." Camilla's eyes widened. "Are you saying someone forged his letter? Or intercepted and replaced it? Did anyone else ever handle your mail?" She shook her head. "Only my housemaid. But I trust her implicitly. Never trust anyone implicitly," Holmes said flatly, "especially in matters of murder." Watson thanked her as they departed, but Holmes's silence lingered until they reached the next address, a quiet shop tucked behind St. James's Market, where Harold Finch, an old rival of Maddox and now a critic for the London aesthetic, kept his studio. The man had the temperament of a snake in molasses, slow, syrupy charm that slithered just beneath politeness. "Tragic business," Holmes, Finch drawled, motioning for them to sit. "Julian and I had our differences, but no one deserved to die like that, so cruel. You were known to have disagreements. Disagreements, yes, not enmity." He despised what I represented, criticism. "But that's the curse of great artists, isn't it? Thin skin." "You reviewed his last showing." "Quite harshly," Watson added. Finch laughed. "It was honest. His final series lacked focus. Portraits without a soul." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "And yet the unfinished painting we found soul was all it had." Finch stiffened slightly. I wouldn't know. I haven't seen it. But you knew it existed, Holmes said gently. Even Lestrade hadn't mentioned it. Curious. The man blinked, then smiled thinly. A slip of the tongue. My apologies. Holmes rose. Not at all. But forgive me, when did you last see Maddox? 2 months ago. We passed each other at a gallery opening. Didn't speak. Then I'm sure he would be surprised to know your name appeared in his ledger last week. The silence thickened. Finch's eyes darkened. I sent a note, an apology. We were old men, Holmes. Sometimes old wars dull to tired skirmishes. Holmes turned to leave. Only when one side surrenders, and Maddox was not one to yield. Back on the street, Watson rubbed his gloved hands. Too many words for too little truth. Exactly. Holmes replied. Finch is lying, but not about the meeting. He lied about the painting. He has seen it, possibly even before the murder. A third conversation was due. With the most reluctant of Maddox's contacts, a framer named Lionel Peakes, who worked from a narrow basement off Blackfriars Lane. He was a man of few words and many debts. I just made the frame, he grunted. Arms folded across his sooty apron. Holmes examined the samples. Yes, but not just any frame. You crafted the ornate gilt used on the unfinished portrait. By Maddox's order. Came in one evening, agitated, said he needed it rushed. Paid in cash. And the subject of the portrait. Peakes looked away. Didn't see it. Not even when delivering the frame. I left it at the door. But someone let you in. The man hesitated, then nodded. Not Maddox, someone else, a younger man. Pale, hair slicked back, cold eyes, said he was Maddox's assistant. Maddox had no assistant. I didn't know that. Holmes leaned closer. And what did he say? Peakes hesitated again. Said Maddox was ill. Asked me not to mention it. Watson stepped forward. Do you think you could identify him? Peakes shook his head. Not if he stood right in front of me. But he had a ring, a silver band, with a small blue stone. Unusual. That was something. Holmes nodded, and they left. Later that evening, Holmes returned to Elias Venn at the asylum, Watson by his side. Venn sat in a rocking chair by the barred window, painting endless circles with his fingers in the air. Elias, Holmes said softly. Who signed the portrait? Venn looked up slowly. The one who made me real. The one who never blinks. What's his name? I gave him no name. He gave himself many. Did Ainsley bring him? No. Venn whispered. Ainsley only opened the door. He was already inside, painting with Julian long before. Holmes stilled. He knew Maddox. He watched Maddox, Venn said. Eyes unfocused. Copied him, studied him, loved him, I think. Or hated him. I can never tell with muses. That night, Holmes stood by the fire, gaze fixed on the flames. Watson waited silently, knowing the mind at work behind the eyes. There is a missing player, Holmes said at last. A man who impersonated Maddox's style. Who wore gloves. Who used Venn and Ainsley as tools. He is the brush behind the signature. And I suspect he's been in the background all along. Watson frowned. Then who is he? Holmes turned toward him, eyes like flint. "We're going to find the last face Maddox painted before the unfinished portrait. It wasn't the killer, but it may be someone who saw him." He paused. "We need to speak to the one who never lied." The paint itself, the following morning, broke with brittle clarity. A low fog clung to the cobblestones, unwilling to lift entirely, as if the city itself wished to obscure the truth just a little longer. Holmes, already dressed, stood at his chemistry table, heating a small dish of dried pigment scrapings beneath a lens. Watson entered with 2 cups of tea, setting one down silently. "The paint," Holmes said without looking up, "is far more talkative than any of our suspects." Watson sipped, waiting. "Prussian blue," Holmes continued, "used sparingly, but only in the background layers of the final portrait, not Maddox's standard palette. He preferred ultramarine warmer, less aggressive. This was a signature choice, and a deliberate one. Whoever painted that background did so with a color Maddox had specifically stopped using years ago, citing interestingly enough a superstition about its cold, watching tone. "And this helps us how?" Watson asked. Holmes finally turned, "Because only someone who knew his aversion to that pigment would use it as a message. Someone close, very." With that, they returned to the Royal Academy, where records of Maddox's exhibitions, patrons, and students were kept in exhaustive detail. Holmes asked for the logs of sittings and sales, particularly around a work titled The Silent Triad, completed 6 months prior, Maddox's last known completed portrait series before his withdrawal from public commissions. Each portrait bore a thematic connection. 3 patrons, seated in silence, eyes cast in different directions. It was the second of these painted for a Miss Vivian DeMarch that caught Holmes's attention. Beneath the registry note, in the margin, Maddox had scrawled, "Saw more than she should. Knows too much, but says nothing. Vivian DeMarch." Holmes muttered, tapping the line. "She has not yet spoken to police. She was in his life recently, and quietly." Watson frowned. "We'll need to find her." They did, in a town home off Bloomsbury, a modest but elegant residence with lace-draped windows and a cat that stared from the upper stairwell like a silent chaperone. Vivian answered the door herself, tall, restrained, with a voice that sounded like she'd lived too long among secrets. "I've already told the inspector I barely knew Julian," she said, ushering them in. "He painted me on recommendation. We only met a handful of times, and yet he wrote about you in his private notes," Holmes said. Vivian's composure cracked slightly. "What did he write? That you saw more than you let on, and that you were afraid?" Her lips parted, then closed again. She sat. "It wasn't fear," she said slowly. "It was doubt. One night, during a break from painting, I returned to the studio after leaving my gloves behind. I came in quietly. Julian was speaking with someone. Who? I don't know." The voice was smooth, practiced. It wasn't angry, just final. Julian was arguing about ownership, about betrayal. I couldn't hear the details, and you didn't step in. I froze, and then left. The next day, Julian said nothing, but he painted faster. He looked over his shoulder more. Holmes nodded. Could you describe the voice? Anything distinctive, educated, unemotional? Not like Ainsley. Colder. Holmes stood abruptly. You've been helpful, Mr. March. I believe you were right not to speak until now. But I ask you not to leave the city. Outside, the afternoon shadows stretched across the street like long fingers. Holmes walked in silence for several blocks. She was truthful, Watson offered. Yes, and now we know the killer had already warned Maddox, days before the murder. But warned him about what? Holmes didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, they returned to Baker Street, where Holmes arranged a series of small cards across the desk, each bearing a name. Ainsley. Venn, Camilla Hartright, Harold Finch, Vivian DeMarch. He picked up Camilla's card. Ambition. She loved Maddox perhaps, but envied him more. If she knew he was going to destroy his legacy with scandal, would she act? He shifted to Ainsley. Fear, financial ruin, exposure. He brought Venn into the picture, hoping to frighten Maddox. Instead, he became complicit. Then Finch, resentment. He loathed being overshadowed. Yet his cowardly hides behind words. Next, Venn, madness, but manipulated. He's not the architect of this. Then Vivian. Holmes paused. Guilt. Watson offered quietly. For not speaking sooner. Holmes didn't respond. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out the sketchbook fragments recovered from Maddox's studio. He flattened the torn edge of a page and carefully aligned it with a small remnant he'd retrieved. From Peaks's framing shop, a corner of a page, used to wrap a chisel. It matched. With careful hands, he read the scroll. He studies my every motion, paints as I do, even laughs the way I laughed when I was young. I have taught a man to become me, and now I fear he will erase me. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He taught someone, not a student, a mimic. Watson's brow furrowed. Are you suggesting? Yes. Holmes interrupted. A man trained to replicate Maddox's style, his voice, his manner. An echo turned dangerous. And that mimic has been here, walking among us. The real murderer did not simply kill Maddox. He became him, long before the final stroke. A knock at the door interrupted them. Lestrade entered, flushed from the climb. We've identified the ring Peaks described. Belongs to a man named Alton Greaves. Name ever come up? Holmes's head snapped up. Greaves, private tutor in fine art, was once accused of forging 3 Maddox pieces, though nothing was proven. Disappeared 2 years ago. Holmes stood. He didn't disappear. He evolved. Alton Greaves is the last piece, a man who once failed to become Maddox professionally, and so decided to become him personally. The mimic. Lestrade frowned. Why now? Because Maddox was going to expose all of them: Ainsley's fraud, Finch's plagiarism, Camilla's imitation, perhaps even Vivian's silent betrayal. Greaves had the most to lose and the most to gain. With Maddox gone, Greaves becomes the last true voice of that style. And the killer, Watson said grimly, but not yet exposed. Holmes said, we've yet to meet him, but he's watching us, waiting. He signed the portrait not just with a name, but with a message. Confess, but not his own sin, Maddox's. Then what do we do? Lestrade asked. Holmes picked up his coat. We find Alton Greaves, and when we do, we show him the one thing he cannot replicate, the truth of a man who knew he was being replaced, and painted his killer before the final blow. The sound of boots echoed through the iron halls of the Eastborough boarding house as Inspector Lestrade led the charge, a warrant in hand, to constables at his back, and a faint tremor of excitement in his voice. He called through the second-floor door with the force of victory already in his tone. Alton Greaves, open up. We have questions about the murder of Julian Maddox. There was a pause too short for flight, too long for innocence. Then the door creaked open. A thin man stood in the doorway, hair slicked neatly back, pale eyes peering out with the unsettling stillness of a man perpetually observing. A small silver ring winked on his right hand. "You're early," he said softly. "I thought you might wait until after tea." Holmes, standing beside Lestrade, studied Greaves in silence. The room was a sparse sanctuary of sketches and ash. Smudged portraits lined the walls, some hauntingly close to Maddox's technique, others rougher. Incomplete, a single unfinished canvas rested in the corner, draped partially. Holmes crossed to it silently and pulled the cloth away. The painting depicted Julian Maddox, or someone like him. The subject was gaunt, eyes wide with confusion, mouth parted as if on the verge of protest. Around him, shadowy forms loomed vague, twisted silhouettes of other known faces from Maddox's circle. Ainsley, Camilla, Finch, even then, all distorted, as if seen through cracked glass. Greaves made no effort to stop them. He leaned against the doorframe with a resigned elegance, as though he had been rehearsing this moment. "I didn't kill him," he said, unprompted. "But I was there." "Go on," Holmes said. Greaves walked to the center of the room, the ring on his finger glinting each time he gestured. "Julian found me in Paris years ago. I had forged one of his early works badly, I'll admit. Instead of turning me in, he brought me under his wing. Said if I insisted on mimicking genius, I ought to be taught by it. A generous offer." Holmes said. "A curse," Greaves replied, "because the closer I got to becoming him, the more he hated me. I painted like him, thought like him, knew every brushstroke before he made it. But I was still a shadow." Holmes watched him closely. "What happened the night he died?" "I brought the frame. He asked me to finish the background of the portrait," said. His hands weren't steady. "I did it gladly. He signed it, with my help." Lestrade interjected. "And after that, I left. I swear." He was alive. Holmes said nothing for a long moment, eyes flicking between the canvas, the paints, and a palette knife drying on a cloth. Lestrade, sensing a breakthrough, moved swiftly. "Alton Greaves, you are under arrest." Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet." Lestrade blinked. "Holmes, the ring, the portrait, the motive, it's all here." "Yes," Holmes said softly. "It's all to here, like a painting that's been overworked." Back at Baker Street, Lestrade was elated. Scotland Yard had a suspect, a confession of proximity, a motive rooted in obsession, and physical evidence in the ring and portrait. The press would run headlines by morning. Holmes, however, sat in his chair without triumph. He held the page fragment from Maddox's sketchbook again, reading the words for the 5th time. He studies my every motion. He laughs the way I laughed when I was young. Watson entered with the evening paper, already displaying a preliminary sketch of Greaves beneath the headline. Maddox killer found brilliant forger unmasked. Don't tell me, Watson said after a moment. Something doesn't sit right. Holmes didn't answer directly. He rose and walked to the mantelpiece, where the photograph of the final portrait rested, captured the day of the murder. Look here, Watson, he said. This stroke along the shoulder. It's too precise, not a tremor, not hesitation. A killer's hand wouldn't have paused to blend shadow into flesh with this kind of intimacy. It's not just mimicry, it's affection. So Greaves loved him, perhaps, but not as Greaves, as someone else. Holmes returned to the notes Vivian had provided, especially the detail she'd nearly forgotten Maddox's voice, heard late one night in the studio, pleading, arguing. But what she dismissed had been the faint sound of another voice, answering soft, clear, and she noted familiar. Holmes began comparing vocal patterns, known acquaintances, and notes. He sent for transcripts from the Royal Academy's guest lectures, one in particular given by a visiting artist. 3 years prior, the name was innocuous, the voice less so. It wasn't Greaves. It was Harold Finch. Watson blinked when Holmes shared the finding. But Finch was once an artist before he became a critic, Holmes said. His brushwork failed him, but his envy remained. He had the voice Vivian heard. He had the access, the motive, and the cowardice to use Greaves as a front. Then why would he paint the portrait? He didn't, Holmes said. He altered it. The signature wasn't added to finish the work. It was added to claim it. Finch knew Maddox was dead when he arrived. Greaves had already left. He slipped in, removed the pages from Maddox's sketchbook, and signed the painting, hoping to cast suspicion toward the man who, by reputation alone, would be irresistible. Bait, a false victory. Holmes returned once more to the studio with Lestrade in tow, insisting on one final detail. In the frame, behind the canvas backing, a strip of parchment had been embedded, a practice Maddox occasionally used for notes or titling. It had not been checked in the rush to catalogue the scene. With tweezers, Holmes withdrew the hidden note. Scrawled in trembling ink were for words. It was never him. Lestrade stood silent. Then, after a long pause, "You mean we've arrested the wrong man?" Holmes nodded. "But the man we need has already confessed, just not with his mouth. He painted it in the margins. We simply weren't looking closely enough, and across the city. In a townhouse with shuttered windows and a fire burning too hot for spring." Harold Finch stared into the embers of his own guilt, knowing that he had struck before the world could forget him. His was the final brushstroke, and it had not yet dried. The lamplight burned low into 1B Baker Street as Holmes sat before the mantel, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the faint imprint of Maddox's signature visible in the photograph of the final portrait. Watson, half dozing in his chair, stirred as Holmes finally spoke, his voice quiet but urgent. I missed it, Watson. Something small, not in the painting itself, but in the paper we found behind it the note. Watson blinked. The one that. Read it was never him. Holmes nodded slowly. It's the ink, Watson. That ink was not Maddox's usual walnut brown. It was carbon-based, fast-drying, and Maddox despised it. He said it bled too harshly onto canvas fiber. But there's only one place I've seen Maddox forced to use it. Watson frowned. Where? Holmes rose and opened his desk drawer, withdrawing a narrow, cracking journal bound in frayed black leather. This, he said, is from an old case, one I was called to consult on 6 years ago, barely a whisper in the press. A fire at the Canterbridge Art School. 3 students perished. The official conclusion was arson, caused by careless oil storage. But Maddox had been there, visiting the week prior, offering mentorship. He left notes in this journal, accusing someone of plagiarizing his work, and in these notes written in haste, he used the same carbon ink. He flipped to a page, tapping the spidery signature. It matches. Watson leaned forward. Are you saying this murder is connected to that fire? Holmes's face darkened. I'm saying it's this same painter. Watson blinked, then whispered, Finch. Holmes nodded. He was a guest lecturer there, teaching criticism. The investigation never considered him a suspect. But listen to this, Maddox wrote. One among them mimics me too well, not for praise. For replacement, he closed the journal. Finch's resentment started earlier than we imagined. Maddox exposed him not to authorities, but to his peers, humiliated him. I believe the fire was no accident. It was destruction by jealousy, and this murder is its echo. At dawn, they visited the long-shuttered ruins of the Canterbridge School, a hushed place now bare brick, sagging beams, silence trapped between soot-streaked walls. Holmes moved through the debris with the stillness of a hunter. At the back of the structure, he stopped. There, he said, Look, in the cracked plaster above a burned doorway, Watson could make out the faded outline of a name, barely visible beneath soot and smoke damage. E. Maddox, room 3. Beside it, scratched hastily into wood, another, name smaller, desperate, H.F., Harold Finch. Watson breathed. Marking what was once his, Holmes said. Even then, trying to take space that didn't belong to him. They returned to London immediately. At Scotland Yard, Lestrade received them with the weariness of a man who had celebrated too early. He'd already dispatched a clerk to prepare Greaves's formal charges, but Holmes's expression stopped him mid-sentence. You must release him, Holmes said simply, or you'll be delivering the wrong man to the hangman. But the evidence was planted by the one who knew where we'd look. We've been played, Inspector. Greaves is the misdirection. Lestrade hesitated, then finally exhaled. Defeated. Then who do we go after? We don't, Holmes said, reaching into his coat and withdrawing a small folded envelope. He'll come to us. I've written a letter, forged in Maddox's hand. It references a lost diary, 1, that details the fire and accuses Finch by name. It says the diary survived the fire and is now in my possession. Watson's eyes widened. That's dangerous, Holmes, it's necessary. Finch can live with whispers and reviews, but not with proof. They waited. That night, Holmes left the sitting room dark. Only the hearth glowed, casting long, soft shadows across the room. The false journal, just a few convincing pages, sat on the desk in plain view. Holmes and Watson waited in silence, hidden behind the study door. The knock came at 2:30. It was not urgent. It was deliberate. Footsteps padded across the room. A gloved hand picked up the book. Pages turned softly. Then Holmes stepped out of the shadows. Looking for inspiration, Mr. Finch? Harold Finch stood frozen, the book in his hands. His expression did not shift, not even in shock. He looked at Holmes with something far worse: recognition. "You always were too curious," Finch said calmly. "It's what ruined Maddox." Holmes moved slowly, angling himself between Finch and the door. "You didn't kill him because of the fire, or even the mimicry. You killed him because he saw you. And worse, he forgave you." Finch's lip curled. "Forgiveness is a luxury granted by those who still have power." Maddox knew he was fading. He knew the world didn't want him anymore. But instead of passing the torch, he mocked us all, his students, his imitators. He painted our failures in brushstrokes and called it art. Holmes's voice was steady. "So you took his final portrait. You claimed it, signed it, painted yourself into history." Finch didn't blink. "And for a while, you believed it. The Yard believed it. The world will, too." Maddox was already forgotten. "I simply ensured it." Behind him, the constables entered. Holmes said nothing. Finch did not resist as the cuffs were slipped over his wrists. "I suppose you'll keep the painting," Finch muttered as he was led away. "Pity. It's my finest work." Holmes stared after him in silence, then turned to the false journal still lying on the desk. He picked it up, weighing it in his hands before tossing it into the fire. Watson said nothing for a long time. Finally, "And the real diary? Maddox's?" Holmes shook his head. "Destroyed in the fire. All we have is what's been left behind." Watson watched the pages curl in flame. "Do you think Maddox knew it would end this way?" "No," Holmes said softly. "But he painted his killer before the blade struck. And that, I believe, was his final truth." The fire crackled quietly in the hearth, and above it, on the mantel, the photograph of the unfinished portrait caught the light one last time, eyes forever watching, brushstrokes forever waiting. Morning drifted in slowly over Baker Street, grey and quiet. The world beyond Holmes's window looked peaceful, misleadingly so. Inside, however, the tension hung thick. Finch was behind bars, but Holmes was far from finished. He stood with hands clasped behind his back, pacing slowly. In front of the hearth, Watson, seated at the table, thumbed through the report Lestrade had delivered that morning. A new fingerprint match had confirmed that Finch had handled the stretcher, carrying Maddox's body, something he'd previously denied. It was damning, but Holmes's gaze remained distant. "There's still something wrong," he murmured. Watson looked up. "The case is solved, Holmes. We have motive, confession, even falsified art. What more is there?" Holmes stopped pacing. "What we have is a man who wanted to be seen, who sought the spotlight. But the way Maddox dyed it was intimate, to clean. No struggle, no visible trauma beyond the broken neck. Finch wanted glory, not silence. Watson frowned. But he didn't confess for praise. He tried to escape blame. Exactly, Holmes replied. But a man like Finch would have wanted his revenge to be witnessed, not hidden behind implication. Yet he claimed the painting, not the death, which suggests one of two things. He wasn't alone, or he wasn't the one who finished the job. A long silence followed. Then Holmes turned to Watson. "We're going to test them. The suspects. Yes, all of them. Together." Watson straightened. "A confrontation." Holmes gave a slight smile. "No, a conversation, but carefully staged." That afternoon, Holmes invited the remaining key players: Camilla Hartwright, Elias Venn, Alton Greaves, now released, and even Vivian DeMarch, to a gathering under the pretext of discussing a posthumous exhibition of Maddox's last works. The venue, Maddox's studio, carefully restored for the occasion. Lestrade agreed to post officers nearby, discreetly positioned, should the need arise. Holmes arranged the setting with precision. The unfinished portrait, now placed upright on an easel in the center of the room, stared outward with its strange, unblinking eyes. A replica journal lay on a side table. Tea was served, light filtered through high windows in gray beams. It was not the warmth of tribute, but the chill of unfinished business. As the guests arrived one by one, Holmes noted every glance, every twitch of muscle. Camilla Hartwright avoided the painting's gaze, then mumbled to himself, eyes darting. Greaves stood behind a chair, hands folded neatly, face unreadable. Vivian was the last to enter. Her eyes went straight to the journal, then the painting, then Holmes. When all were seated, Holmes spoke. "Thank you for coming. As many of you know, Julian Maddox's final portrait was not merely art, it was witness. He painted it in his last hours, possibly in the presence of the man who would end his life. This gathering is meant to help preserve his legacy, but also to honor the truth." Camilla shifted. "You think one of us knows more than we've said?" Holmes smiled politely. "I know one of you does." He turned to Venn, whose rocking had grown more erratic. "Mr. Venn, do you recall what Maddox called his final work?" Venn blinked, lips working. "No name, just silence. Silence like a needle." Holmes nodded. "He told someone it would be called Inheritance. That is curious, don't you think, Miss Hartwright?" Camilla's eyes narrowed. "He never said that to me, but it would make sense." Holmes said softly, "Inheritance of skill, of sin, of secrets. A legacy passed through hands not by blood, but by obsession." He moved to the painting and gestured toward the lower corner. "What's interesting is that the killer, whoever he was, didn't deface this. He claimed it. That tells us something very specific." Vivian DeMarch stood. "You brought us here to provoke someone." Holmes gave her a slow, acknowledging look. "Not provoke. Miss DeMarch, reveal. We have something new, something none of you knew existed." He turned and opened a small velvet case. Inside was a glass slide, a sliver of canvas mounted for viewing under a loupe, under magnification. The paint on this slide taken from the signature shows 2 layers. One Maddox's, the other more recent, but the second layer carries something more specific, a trace of strontium yellow, a pigment rarely used, and only by a few. He turned the slide gently. It was Camilla Hartright's preferred pigment seen in 5 of her recent works. Camilla froze. Holmes didn't. Wait, you added to the painting, Miss Hartright. You claimed it. I only adjusted a shade, she said quickly. Julian allowed it. He was too tired to finish. Holmes shook his head. You touched the canvas after his death, and you weren't alone. Maddox didn't die by strangulation or bludgeon. His neck was broken by a precise twist and anatomical move. And the only person in this room with formal medical training besides myself is you. Mr. March. Vivian stared at him, stunned. That's absurd. Holmes stepped forward slowly. You were the last to see him alive, and the first to benefit. Maddox had promised to destroy a painting of you, hadn't he? One that showed more than you wished the world to see. She hesitated. Perhaps he had hinted at scandal your name. Whispered in gallery salons, intertwined with patrons. He knew too much. You went there to talk sense into him. Camilla followed. Maybe out of jealousy, maybe to stop you. Camilla stood, furious. I never laid a hand on him. Holmes turned to Lestrade, who stepped in from the adjoining room. I believe if we search Miss Hartright's apartment, we will find a pigment tube with strontium residue matching the forgery. Lestrade nodded, already underway. Then Holmes turned to Vivian again. As for you, you knew how to end a life quietly. You killed him while Camilla watched. You both staged it, one for silence, one for art. But there's one detail neither of you knew. He returned to the painting and touched the back of the frame. Maddox had hidden a strip of tracing paper between canvas and board. It bore the original sketch of the painting along with a note. He held it up. The faint ink just legible under LAMPLIGHT. Camilla forgives. Vivian will not. If this is found, I was not alone. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, Vivian sank into her chair, white as bone. Camilla didn't want him dead, she said softly. She only wanted her name beside his. I only wanted him quiet. He was going to ruin everything. Holmes stared at her. He already did. He painted the truth, even if no one saw it until now. Lestrade stepped forward. Vivian DeMarch, you are under arrest for the murder of Julian Maddox, Camilla Hartright. You will be held for conspiracy and obstruction of justice, as both women were taken away. The room remained still. Greaves, silent until now, stepped forward and stood beside the portrait. He knew we were all pretending. He said quietly, even when we weren't lying. Holmes nodded once. He gave us one final canvas, Holmes said, and let us hang ourselves on it. Rain tapped a steady rhythm against the windows of 221B Baker Street, as Holmes stood motionless before the fireplace, the flickering flames casting his profile into angular shadow. Watson sat nearby, a telegram open in his hand, unread for a moment. As he observed Holmes's unusually tense stillness, the case had cracked open in spectacular fashion. Vivian DeMarch rested. Camilla Hartright implicated, and Finch thoroughly unmasked, but the air felt far from triumphant. Holmes finally spoke without turning. "They've taken it." Watson blinked. "Taken what?" "The tracing paper," Holmes said. "The original sketch Maddox hid inside the canvas. It's gone." Watson leapt to his feet. "But you had it. You showed it at the studio." "I did," Holmes replied, "and afterward I handed it to Inspector Lestrade to be logged into evidence. An hour ago, I received this." He gestured to a folded sheet on the mantel. "Lestrade's. The man went to retrieve it this morning for analysis." The envelope was still sealed, but inside, only blank parchment. No sketch, no note. Watson's throat tightened. Then someone inside the yard tampered with it. "Possibly," Holmes murmured, "or someone with access found a way to intercept and replace it before it was ever logged." Watson walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. It was thick, standard police issue, initialed and dated. Lestrade signed this himself. He did, which suggests someone acted after. He sealed it or used an identical envelope to switch it entirely. The fire cracked. Holmes stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the curling corners of the empty parchment. The sketch was not simply symbolic. It confirmed Maddox's awareness of both women's involvement. Without it, the case against Camilla weakens. Vivian may still hang, but someone is fighting to muddy the rest. Watson looked up. "Who benefits now that Vivian's arrested?" Holmes's reply was instant. "Anyone who stood in the second shadow, and someone very clever, someone who's remained silent, observant, someone who knew exactly how Maddox documented his private thoughts." He turned sharply. "We must speak to Alton Greaves again." They found him at his shared flat above a bookbinder's shop in Bloomsbury. The young artist opened the door with visible fatigue, but something in his manner had changed, less haunted, more controlled. A canvas leaned behind him on an easel, covered in black cloth. "You've heard?" Holmes asked. Greaves nodded. "About the missing sketch?" "Lestrade was here. Asked if I had any duplicates. I didn't." Holmes stepped inside uninvited. "You were closer to Maddox than anyone. He taught you. He trusted you. Do you know who would go to such lengths to erase his last word?" Greaves met Holmes's gaze without flinching. "Isn't that obvious? Hartright. She's in custody." Holmes said, "No access. Not without help." Greaves folded his arms. "Then someone is helping her. Maybe from inside the gallery or the academy. Plenty of people who hated Maddox but loved his myth." Holmes circled the room slowly. "But not you?" "No," Greaves said. "I only wanted to be seen. I never needed him to vanish." Holmes stopped at the easel. "May I?" Greaves hesitated, then slowly nodded. Holmes drew back the cloth. The painting was startling. A half-finished portrait of Maddox, again this time twisted in a more abstract style, surrounded by mirror fragments, distorted faces peering through cracks. Each eye in the canvas seemed drawn from different subjects. One from Venn, one from Camilla, one unmistakably Vivian's. Watson stepped forward. "This is new. Since the arrest," Greaves said softly. "I wanted to record it before it was forgotten. All the faces he captured, all the lies he painted over." Holmes looked closer. His eyes landed on a barely visible smear of pale grey under Maddox's collar. "You layered this." Greaves nodded. "3 glazes deep. It was originally just him, alone. But that felt false." Holmes was silent a long moment, then turned back to him. "Alton, that parchment was sealed. Whoever replaced it did so with precision. Not a blur, not a tear. The kind of switch you only get right if you understand how the original was concealed." Greaves stiffened. "You think I stole it? I think you're protecting someone," Holmes said. "Or protecting something larger than one truth. Maybe you believe Maddox wanted the ambiguity. That his final work wasn't a confession, but a challenge." Greaves didn't speak. Holmes stepped back. "If I find that sketch again, I will expose every name on it, whether they struck the blow or watched it fall." Watson added quietly, "And if we don't find it." Holmes's eyes darkened. "Then someone else controls the narrative." They returned to Baker Street just after dusk. Lestrade was waiting, hat in hand, jaw tight. "It's worse than we thought," he said as they entered. "The original frame Maddox's last portrait was removed from the Yard's archive this afternoon. A constable reported it as transferred for conservation, but we never issued the order." Holmes froze. "The frame, yes." Watson frowned. "But why the frame?" Holmes answered before Lestrade could. "Because that's where the sketch actually was. The parchment I removed was a decoy. The real tracing was still inside the wood itself, behind the stretcher bar. Maddox left it into parts, one visible, one hidden, and now both are gone." Lestrade cursed under his breath. Then the theft wasn't just about weakening the case. It was about erasing Maddox's last word completely. Holmes turned to the window, watching the reflection of the room in the glass. The way gaslight split his silhouette into double. Someone knew better than any of us. That painting was never meant to last. It was a time bomb, and now the fuse is gone. Watson stepped forward. "Holmes, who is still out there?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He walked to his desk, picked up Maddox's original pigment chart, the one Greaves had identified early in the case, and held it up to the firelight. One sample had been replaced, just subtly. A cooler hue, Prussian blue, where ultramarine once had been. "I think Maddox knew he was surrounded by chameleons," Holmes said. "So he left them the one thing they couldn't alter, his own memory. But now that memory is being rewritten." Watson's voice was tight. "What do we do?" Holmes's answer was almost a whisper. "We make them show their hand." And outside, the rain began to fall harder, as though trying to wash away something London wasn't meant to remember. The wind had turned bitter by morning, scattering yesterday's fog across the Thames like a memory reluctant to fade. In Baker Street, the quiet was suddenly shattered by the sound of boots on the stairs and a harsh knock at the door. Holmes opened it before Mrs. Hudson could reach it. Lestrade stood there, pale, rain soaking the brim of his hat. "We have another body," he said without preamble. "It's Elias Venn." Holmes didn't flinch. "Where?" "His gallery. Found early this morning. Locked from the inside." Holmes and Watson were dressed and out the door within minutes. The Venn gallery sat in Mayfair, an austere Wade guarding a world of chaos. Inside, the lights flickered in morning gloom. A constable stood near the entrance to the central room, lips pressed tight. Lestrade led them through without words. Venn lay crumpled at the base of a sculpture pedestal, his head twisted unnaturally to the side, eyes still wide, mouth parted in what could have been disbelief or terror. A shattered teacup lay beside him. The nearby table bore to chairs, one untouched. A bottle of wine stood open. 2 glasses poured, one full, the other emptied. Watson crouched near the body, neck broken, swiftly, no visible signs of struggle. Holmes was already moving, eyes combing the room. A mirror of Maddox's death. Same method, same silence. Lestrade looked troubled. Could it be suicide staged to look like murder? No. Holmes replied, already scanning the room's corners. Venn was not capable of such deception. His soul was too fragile. But someone knew he was the weakest link in the chain. He approached a large canvas hanging on the back wall, an abstract by Maddox, its surface frayed from age. Holmes lifted the edge, revealing the frame's backing. It had been slit cleanly, from top to bottom. They were searching for something. Lestrade frowned. What evidence? Or perhaps the second tracing, the one Maddox may have left, hidden here if indeed he kept multiple pieces of his final thoughts. Holmes stepped back, his voice low and precise. This wasn't retribution. It was containment. Venn had begun remembering too much, or were stalking. Watson rose. You believe the killer is still targeting those connected to the painting? No. Holmes said, his gaze darkening. I believe the killer is targeting anyone who might expose that the painting was only part of the message. Holmes knelt briefly beside Venn and touched the base of the pedestal. His fingers came away with a faint smear of greenish powder. Verdigris, he said softly. Oxidized bronze. The killer wore gloves that had handled aged sculpture possibly. Even stolen one. It's not paint. It's residue. Watson looked around the gallery. There are dozens of bronze pieces here. But what are we missing? Holmes didn't answer. He crossed to a storage cabinet, unlocked by gallery staff, and began rifling through inventory lists. There, he said, a small bust of Maddox bronze, recently commissioned but unfinished. It's missing from the back room. Lestrade blinked. Why steal that? Because it wasn't just a likeness, Holmes replied. It may have held something. A cavity, a note, a key. Venn mentioned once to Camilla that Maddox was considering a kind of living signature, something hidden inside a sculpture that would only be discovered long after his death. He believed legacy wasn't what we left behind, but what we buried. Watson spoke quietly, and someone's been unburying it piece by piece. Holmes turned to Lestrade. You must seal this gallery. Every work must be catalogued and X-rayed. If Maddox embedded something else, we need it before our murderer returns. Lestrade nodded grimly. And what about Greaves? Holmes paused. He may still be the final witness, or the final target. They returned to Bloomsbury in haste. The door to Greaves's flat stood ajar. Holmes drew his revolver before stepping inside. The flat was in disarray, not ransacked but abandoned in haste. A cup of coffee still steamed slightly on the desk. The half-finished portrait of Maddox remained on the easel, now altered again, the background filled in completely, darkened, abstracted into a swirling mass of tangled shapes and eyes. Watson moved to the desk. No sign of a struggle. Holmes went directly to the fireplace. The ash was still warm. Reaching in with a poker, he lifted a partially burned corner of parchment. There was ink smudged but visible. 2 words could still be read. He knew. Holmes stood straight, jaw tightening. Greaves is gone. Either fled or taken. Watson frowned. But why burn this? To confuse us. To make us think he ran in fear. But he didn't finish the job. If he had destroyed a confession, he'd have done so completely. This was interrupted. Lestrade, just arriving behind them, looked from the scene to Holmes. Whoever is behind this, do you still believe they're connected to the painting? Holmes turned, eyes sharp. I believe they're connected to everything. The painting, the first sketch, the stolen frame, the gallery theft. The killings are only symptoms. The illness lies in what Maddox knew and what he left behind. Outside, the wind had begun to rise again, brushing along rooftops like a whisper of approaching danger. Holmes stared at the half-finished painting on the easel. In the thick, crowded shadows, a single shape stood out, a barely painted face near the edge. It was subtle, nearly lost in the dark hues, but the mouth twisted in a half-smile and the tilt of the eyes. Watson, Holmes said softly, "Get me the mirror." Watson fetched the one from the desk drawer. Holmes held it up beside the painting. Reversed in reflection, the faint figure came into focus. It was not Maddox, nor Camilla, nor Fynch. It was Holmes. Not precisely, but unmistakably him. And it had been drawn from memory, not reference. Deliberately painted into the periphery. Watson's breath caught. "He painted you." Holmes nodded once. "Then he knew," Watson whispered. "He knew you'd be the one to follow it." Holmes spoke without moving. "Or he knew I'd be the next to die." And in that moment, everything grew still before the sound of glass breaking echoed faintly from the roof above. The shatter of glass from the rooftop sent Holmes moving in a blur. He rushed through Greaves's flat and into the narrow stairwell leading upward, revolver drawn, Watson close behind. Rain whipped across the top of the building, and in the half-light of dawn, they saw the source, a broken skylight panel near the chimney, jagged shards glittering like teeth. No figure remained, but the edge of the frame still vibrated faintly. Someone had just slipped away. Holmes scanned the rooftops. Nothing but shifting shadows. Then he turned back, motioning to Watson. "Downstairs. Now." Whoever it was wasn't here to attack. They were watching. Inside the flat, Holmes moved quickly. His eyes darted across the room past the portrait, the ash in the fireplace, the abandoned coffee, then stopped. On the floor near the window lay something pale and thin. A strip of tracing vellum, partially crumpled, nearly lost among the folds of curtain. Holmes lifted it gently. The surface was blank at first. Then, as Watson leaned in, Holmes tilted it under the lamplight. A faint pattern appeared in dents, not ink, pressed too lightly to be seen directly, but enough to leave a ghost. Holmes moved to the desk, retrieving a charcoal pencil and thin paper. With careful precision, he laid the clean sheet atop the vellum and began to rub gently. The image that emerged was simple, yet unmistakable. A chessboard. Watson frowned. A sketch? Holmes studied it. No, it's more than that. It's a position. He moved to the fireplace mantel, retrieving a small folding board he'd seen earlier among Greaves's things. Setting it down, he placed the pieces to match the sketch. White queen side bishop fianchettoed. Black king castled, a knight pushed too early, now stranded. It's the Berlin defense. Holmes murmured. Watson looked baffled. You think? Our killer plays chess, not just plays, Holmes said slowly. Understands strategy intimately. This is a message. The game shows a trap. An early sacrifice meant to bait the opponent into overextending. His eyes narrowed as he reached for another piece of vellum beside the painting. It had been hidden behind the easel's ledge, unnoticed before. This one bore a series of short notations, like names abbreviated into cryptic shorthand. KM, CF, VD, AG. Watson read aloud. Holmes tapped the table. Initials. The same order as our suspects. Maddox was tracking their moves like chess pieces. But what was the board? Watson asked. Holmes turned back to the painting, to the swirling abstraction behind Maddox's portrait. Slowly, he walked closer. Then he froze. His hand reached out and traced the pattern. Not eyes, not chaos. Squares. The background was a chessboard, not drawn with clean lines, but embedded in shadow and texture. Faint, but there. Holmes stepped back, letting the full image settle in his mind. Maddox was building a puzzle. He said, each suspect a piece, each action a move. Watson joined him. But who was playing? Holmes's voice was quiet. He was, and someone else. This isn't just a portrait, it's a game played to the death. Holmes sat abruptly, fingers steepled under his chin. The room fell still. Then, with growing clarity, he spoke. There was something Greaves said weeks ago, in passing, about Maddox's process. He said Maddox never started with a subject. He started with the light. The shadows guided him. Watson frowned. Yes, Holmes stood again, eyes gleaming. Then why is the light in this painting inconsistent? The left side of the face is illuminated, but the shadows don't fall properly across the background. That inconsistency always bothered me, but now I understand. He grabbed a candle from the side table and placed it to the painting's left, mimicking the source in the portrait. Then he moved his hand slowly across the surface. When the shadow hit a small bronze nail in the frame's lower right corner, it disappeared entirely, swallowed by a thin slit in the wood, invisible without movement. Holmes took a blade from his pocket and delicately pried open the seam. A roll of paper emerged, tightly wound, no longer than a finger. Watson leaned forward. Is it the real tracing? Holmes unrolled it carefully. No, this was not the same sketch. This was a letter in Maddox's elegant, slanted hand, to the one who seized the board. If you are reading this, then I am dead either by envy's hand or my own misjudgment. I have long known that my art would outlast me, but I feared it would also outlie me. The ones around me love the stage, not the work. They are not artists. They are pretenders playing roles. You must know, I did not fear dying. I feared becoming invisible. So I built the board, one square at a time. And now you see the final piece. I never finished the portrait not because I ran out of time, but because I wanted you to step inside. There was no signature, only a final mark. Upon Holmes stared at it for a long time. Watson whispered he knew he was being hunted, and instead of escaping, he turned the whole thing into a riddle, a final move. Holmes nodded slowly. The clue was never in the faces. It was in the positions. Who stood where? Who moved when? And one piece moved too early. He grabbed the earlier inventory list from Ven's gallery. A sculpture, he muttered. A bust of Maddoxon finished, taken after his death. But the thief didn't know Maddox had used resin cast instead of solid bronze. It would have made it too light for authentic display unless. He stopped, then turned to Watson. It wasn't a sculpture. It was a shell, a container. For what? Holmes's voice was low. For the truth. He picked up the list. Again, one item stood out. Bronze head with removable base, not yet engraved. Watson caught the implication. You think the real killer has it? Holmes nodded. Or worse, they've already hidden what was inside. A long silence passed before he added, but they've left fingerprints. Maybe not on the sculpture, but in their choices, their timing. The game was never just between Maddox and his killer. He looked up. It's still being played. Holmes stood in complete stillness, the final line of Maddox's note echoing in the dim silence of Greaves's flat. I wanted you to step inside it. It was not just metaphor, it was instruction. A cipher built in brushstrokes, guiding the investigator deeper into the canvas, into the stage Maddox had crafted long before his death. Watson, standing behind him, spoke softly. Holmes, what do you think was hidden in the bust? Holmes's eyes didn't move from the note. Not a confession, a provocation. A piece designed not to solve the mystery but to ignite it. A knock sounded at the door below, followed by hurried footsteps. Moments later, Lestrade burst into the room, face pale and breath short. We found the sculpture, he said, abandoned in an alley near the south bank. Hollowed out. Empty? Holmes gave no sign of surprise. Lestrade went on. But there's more. The Academy's archival clerk was found unconscious this morning. Files on Maddox's personal history letters, records. Even art school admission documents were removed, burned in the courtyard bin. Someone's trying to erase him. Holmes finally looked up. Not erase him, control how he's remembered. He stepped to the fireplace again, gaze sharpening. I need access to Maddox's full catalogue, every exhibition, every critique, every patron. Lestrade hesitated. Why? Because this isn't about a single painting, Holmes said. It's about an identity. One that was never entirely his. Watson narrowed his eyes. You think Maddox wasn't who we thought he was? Holmes didn't answer directly. He retrieved the charcoal rubbing of the chessboard sketch and the initials list. With brisk precision, he circled the names Ag and CF, Camilla Hartright, Alton Greaves. Everyone assumed their connections to Maddox were personal, mentorship, romance, rivalry. But they shared something deeper an origin. Lestrade stepped closer. You believe they were related, not by blood, by invention. Holmes pulled out an old exhibition leaflet he'd pocketed from the gallery. The date was from 12 years ago. This show featured two paintings both signed J. Maddox. One was dated before Maddox's official debut. The Academy rejected it as forgery. Yet Maddox never denied it. Why? Watson looked over Holmes's shoulder. Because he was. The forger. Because he wasn't the original. Holmes replied. Julian Maddox, as we knew him, was not a single artist. He was a construct, a name, a legend, pieced together by several hands. Greaves, Hartright, Venn, even DeMarch. In her way, each added to the myth, and in return, benefited from the illusion. Watson's eyes widened. They created him? Holmes nodded. Years ago, in obscurity, they began as collaborators, anonymous. The myth of the solitary genius was more valuable than for struggling apprentices. Maddox became their mask, and then he became real. To real, Lestrade muttered. Then who died that night? Greaves's cousin, the true Maddox, or rather, the closest thing to him. Holmes's voice was low and deliberate. He was the only one who ever signed his name without needing permission, and that made him a liability. Watson exhaled slowly. They killed him to protect the illusion. Not all of them. Holmes corrected. Some only wanted silence. Others wanted control. That's the heart of this crime, Watson. Not money, not revenge, not even legacy, identity. He moved to the portrait on the easel that twisted. Shadowed image now filled in with hints of a dozen faces. They couldn't share credit, because in art, especially the kind the Academy rewards, only one name matters. Julian Maddox was no longer a man. He was a brand, and someone wanted exclusive ownership. Holmes's fingers hovered above the painting. The original Maddox had threatened to go public, expose the collaboration, possibly even change his will to reflect the truth. That's what triggered it. But the killer didn't just want to stop him. They wanted to erase the evidence, rewrite history. Watson stepped forward, realization dawning. Vivian helped them. Hartright painted over the truth. Greaves knew, but remained silent. And then, he couldn't take the guilt. Holmes nodded. Exactly. And the one orchestrating the cover-up from the shadows is still out there. Lestrade stared at him. Who? Holmes answered with certainty. Alton Greaves. The name dropped like stone into water. Watson blinked. But he's the one who left the apartment, who painted that image of you, who kept warning us. Greaves is the most dangerous kind of liar, Holmes said softly. The one who appears weak, who paints himself as a bystander. But he had motive, access, and time. He was the one who handled the sculpture before it was stolen. He forged the exhibit records. He knew every corner of Maddox's life because he built it. Lestrade clenched his jaw. So he staged his own disappearance? Yes, Holmes said, to buy time, to complete the final rewrite. But he didn't anticipate Maddox's fail-safe, the letter hidden in the frame. And now that we've found it, Greaves will strike again. Watson looked at him. Why hasn't he fled? Because he doesn't want to run, Holmes replied. He wants to win. He wants to become the last surviving architect of the Maddox myth. And for that, he needs to eliminate the last person who knows the whole story. Watson stared at him. You. Holmes smiled thinly. Indeed. There was a knock at the door again, this time gentler, more deliberate. Lestrade moved to check it, but Holmes raised a hand. Wait. He moved toward the entrance himself, footsteps measured. Then, quietly, he turned the knob. On the landing stood a boy no older than 12 with a parcel in his hand. Message from Mr. Holmes, the boy said, then turned and disappeared down the steps before anyone could stop him. Holmes opened. The parcel inside was a small canvas, no bigger than a hand. A quick sketch charcoal, but unmistakable. It was Holmes, again. But this time, the eyes were closed. A single red line ran from his temple down the side of his face, a mock obituary, painted in haste. Greaves's challenge. Holmes turned it in his hands. He's inviting us to the endgame, he said. And this time, the board is mine. Nightfall brought a sharp wind across the rooftops of Whitechapel, tugging at chimney smoke and rattling iron shutters. Holmes moved through the city like a thread through cloth, swift, unseen, guided by logic and inevitability. The boy's painting had been the final signal. Greaves wasn't running. He was inviting Holmes into the center of his design, the final room in a house of mirrors. By 9 o'clock, Holmes had orchestrated every detail of the trap. Lestrade positioned his men discreetly in the alley behind the old glassworks near Lambeth, the very place Greaves and Maddox once worked before the myth began. It had been closed 4 years. The records showed Greaves had recently leased the basement for studio use. To public to hide forever, to private to be overlooked. Watson stood at Holmes's side outside the blackened door, his revolver hidden beneath his coat. You're certain he'll come here? Holmes didn't answer immediately. Then, this isn't a pursuit anymore, Watson. It's theater. He's waiting for his audience. With a nod to Lestrade, they entered. The old studio smelled of turpentine and time. Oil paints long gone rancid lingered in the air. A single light bulb buzzed faintly overhead. At the center of the room, surrounded by unfinished canvases, stood a covered easel. And behind it, seated in a plain wooden chair, was Alton Greaves. He looked older somehow, his hair unkempt, shirt flecked with paint and dust. Yet his posture was straight, hands folded in his lap. A man neither surprised nor afraid. You're late, he said. Holmes approached slowly, silent. Watson stayed back, eyes scanning the shadows. I thought, Greaves continued, you might hesitate, or worse, send Lestrade to arrest me like some common thief. But no, here you are, properly dressed. You even shaved. Holmes's voice was calm. I thought you'd appreciate the respect due to a curtain call. Greaves smirked. Then you understand. It was never murder. It was art. Completion. The death of Maddox wasn't a crime, it was the final stroke. Watson took a step forward, but Holmes raised a hand to halt him. "You manipulated everyone," Holmes said. "The students, the press, the gallery. You staged Maddox's death as a locked-room puzzle. Made it theatrical, deliberately impossible. Because what you wanted wasn't just to be free of him. You wanted to own him." Greaves rose. "He was never real. Don't you see? Maddox was an illusion created by all of us. But I was the one who gave him voice. I painted the first pieces that made people believe. Hartright had technical skill, then had gallery connections. Vivian was all rage and fire, but I was the soul. And when the soul began to speak against the body," Holmes said softly, "you tore it free." Greaves stepped to the covered easel. "He told me he was going to confess, publish it in his will. Make us all complicit," he said. "Let the world see the truth." But the world doesn't want truth. They want genius. They want myth. So I gave them one. He pulled back the cloth. The painting revealed was not a portrait of Maddox. It was a painting of Holmes, stark, monochrome. But unlike the previous sketches, this one was complete. It showed Holmes standing before a chessboard, alone, every other piece overturned or missing. His face bore no expression, his eyes hollow. Watson recoiled slightly. "You see," Greaves said, voice low, intense, "I knew how this would end. You'd come here. You'd find everything. But you'd be too late, because now you're the final piece, the last signature, the detective who failed to save the artist. You've been painted into the myth." Holmes stepped forward, close now. "I didn't fail, Alton," he said. "You did." Greaves's expression twitched. Holmes continued, "You forgot the one rule Maddox lived by. No piece is finished until the shadow is complete. And in your haste to rewrite the ending, you left something behind." From his coat pocket, Holmes produced a folded sheet of paper, Maddox's true final tracing, recovered from the seal sculpture Lestrade had retrieved. Hidden inside the frame Greaves had thought he destroyed. Greaves's mouth parted. "This," Holmes said, "is Maddox's real ending. A portrait of you, not stylized, not obscured, just you, standing behind him, holding the brush, not the knife, the brush, because he knew what you were." Holmes turned the sheet, revealing the sketch to Greaves fully. "You weren't a murderer, Greaves. Not then. You were a forger, a mimic, a jealous shadow who thought he was owed a place in the light. But you killed the very thing you built. And now, no canvas can redeem that." Greaves's hands trembled. "You think the world will care," he whispered. "They'll still believe in Maddox. They'll still hang his works." "Yes," Holmes said, "but they'll also know who you are. Not a visionary, just a frightened man who killed for credit he could never earn." For a long moment, Greaves said nothing. Then he turned slowly and reached behind the easel. Watson tensed, weapon ready. But Greaves didn't draw a gun. He pulled out a small glass jar, turpentine, and a match. "No," Holmes said sharply, stepping forward. But Greaves had already struck the match. "I'll burn it all," he said. Let the ashes tell the truth. Before the flame touched canvas, Lestrade's men surged forward through the door. The match was knocked from his hand. Greaves was wrestled to the ground, howling not with rage, but grief. The grief of a man who had destroyed everything he loved to become something he never could be. Outside, the wind howled against the old walls of the studio. Holmes turned from the easel, from the portrait, from the ruined man on the floor. He walked out into the night without a word, Watson by his side back on Baker Street. Long past midnight, Holmes sat by the fire, the faint scent of turpentine still in his coat. Watson brought him tea, then sat across from him in silence. After some time, Holmes said, "He was right about one thing." Watson looked up. "What's that?" "No one remembers the painter, only the painting." Watson's reply was gentle. "But this time, Holmes, they'll remember the man who saw the whole canvas." Holmes gave the faintest smile, then let the fire speak for them both, crackling softly into the dawn. The fire had nearly died when the knock came gentle, uncertain. Holmes, seated in a deep leather chair, rose with the deliberate calm of a man who expects no more visitors. Watson stirred slightly from his half-doze, glancing toward the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice called up the stairs. "Mr. Holmes, there's a young woman here. Insists it's urgent." Holmes exchanged a look with Watson, then moved to open the door himself. Standing on the threshold was a woman they had never seen before. She was no more than 20. With pale features and intelligent eyes that studied Holmes not with fear or reverence, but with quiet calculation. "You don't know me," she said, "but my name is Lydia Maddox. Julian was my brother." Watson blinked. "Brother?" But Maddox had no surviving family. "That's what Alton Greaves wanted you to believe," Lydia said evenly, stepping inside. "That's what they all wanted. Because if you'd known the truth, you would have asked very different questions." Holmes motioned to the chair opposite the fire, his mind already racing. "Speak," he said. She sat without hesitation. "Julian wasn't born in London. He grew up in Newcastle. My mother raised both of us. He was 6 years older. He left when he was 17 to study art. I stayed. For years, I only heard from him in letters." She reached into her coat and retrieved a small bundle of old envelopes, brittle with time. Holmes took one and unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Julian's. "They want to use me, Lyd. They say it's all part of the show, part of the vision. But I'm starting to think I'm the only one whose real Holmes looked up. And you never came forward?" "I tried," Lydia said. "But by the time I arrived in London, Julian was already dead, and the story was sealed. Greaves had made sure of it. He convinced the press, the academy, even the police that Julian had no surviving kin. I was dismissed, told I was confused, told to leave it alone." Watson's voice was tight. "You should have come to us sooner. I didn't know who to trust. Not until I saw the news of the arrest and the painting." She reached again into her coat, producing a photograph torn from the paper the sketch Greaves had sent to Holmes. The one that resembled a mock obituary. But it wasn't Holmes they were painting. She said softly, Not entirely. Look at the left eye. Holmes leaned in, the left eye ever so slightly different in structure, tilt, even shading, off just enough to feel foreign. It's Julian, Lydia said. It's his expression, his gaze. I've seen it all my life. That painting wasn't about you. It was about replacing him. Watson stiffened. Greaves wanted to subsume the entire legacy, not just kill Maddox, but wear his memory like a mask. Lydia nodded, but he couldn't. Not completely, not without one last piece. That's why he sent the painting to you, Mr. Holmes, because he needed a witness, someone to legitimize the ending. Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke very softly. He meant to provoke me into declaring the case closed, so his version would be the one history remembered. Lydia's voice trembled. But it's not closed, is it? No, Holmes said. Not yet. He rose and retrieved the final letter. Maddox had hidden inside the sculpture the one Holmes had believed revealed the truth. But as he laid it beside Lydia's envelopes, a new possibility crept into his mind. The signature upon. He had assumed it meant Julian saw himself as a player. But what if it was a reference? He moved quickly to his bookshelf, retrieving Maddox's earliest catalogue, the Pons Requiem, an obscure early piece, only exhibited once, dismissed as juvenile and overly symbolic. Holmes had passed it over before, but now, opening it to the back page, he found something unexpected. A dedication to Elle who knows that truth cannot be framed. Watson looked over his shoulder. It's her. Lydia's voice cracked. He wanted me to protect it. All of it. And I failed. No. Holmes said gently, closing the book. You've just given us the key. He walked to the desk, where the sketch of the chessboard lay beside Greaves's forged painting. The position, the empty spaces, it hadn't been a trap. It had been a message. Holmes placed the portrait beside the catalogue. The left eye, the missing bishop, the final pawn. Then he turned sharply. Lestrade must retrieve everything confiscated from the gallery's vault, including the crate of Maddox's unsold work. There's something still hidden. Not a sketch, not a letter. Watson caught on. Another painting? No, Holmes said. A forgery. One of Greaves's. Earliest. The one he never let anyone see. He buried it in the back of the archive before Maddox's rise passed it off as discarded. But it's the real confession. Hours later, when the crate was finally opened under gaslight in Scotland Yard, they found it. A canvas covered in plaster and gesso, mislabeled as study, unfit for display. But when the top layer was scraped back, another painting emerged. 3 men, facing away from the viewer Greaves, then Hartright, and in the center, a 4th figure, seated, chained, gagged, Julian Maddox. The artist had painted himself as a prisoner in his own myth. And beneath the frame, carved into the wood, they made me. But I remember who I am. Watson stared at it in silence. Holmes whispered, that was the final move. The world would eventually learn the full story, though it would take years. The painting would be authenticated. Lydia would reclaim her brother's name, and the myth of Maddox once seamless and haunting would fracture into something messier. But far more human. Holmes returned to Baker Street just before sunrise. As he stepped inside, Watson poured the tea without needing to ask this time. Holmes accepted it without comment. He sat before the fire, as he had so many nights before, but with the rare expression of closure softening his features. Then, with a faint smile, he muttered, "The game's beauty, Watson, lies not in victory, but in revealing the board." The fire had long since burned low. Morning sunlight crept across the walls of 2-1 Baker Street, painting streaks of gold over the old furniture and worn carpet. Holmes remained in his chair, hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed but very much awake. Watson sat across from him, reading the latest column from the Times. The headline sprawled in bold across the page: Maddox Myth Unmasked, Forgery, Murder, and the Art of Deception. Below it was a photograph of Alton Greaves being led out of Scotland Yard, pale and silent, eyes fixed on the ground as reporters hurled questions. He never answered. Watson folded the paper carefully. He hasn't spoken. Not a word since the arrest. Holmes responded without opening his eyes. He will not. Greaves has painted his final piece. His silence is the signature. And the others? Watson asked. Hartright, Venn, DeMarch, shattered. Holmes replied simply. Hartright has already resigned from the Academy. Venn is in Paris, under investigation for prior forgeries. Vivian is preparing a public statement, though I suspect she'll frame herself as a victim of Greaves's manipulation. Watson sipped his tea, watching Holmes closely, and Lydia Maddox. She's returned to Newcastle for now, Holmes said, but the will has been reopened. She will inherit what remains of Julian's estate. More importantly, the Academy is reviewing Maddox's entire catalogue. The man will finally be known not just for what he created but for what he endured. Watson nodded, then leaned forward. There's still something I don't understand. All those clues, the painting of you, the missing bishop on the board, the letters. How did you know they were connected? I was there with you, and yet I missed half of it. Holmes opened his eyes at last. Because you were trying to follow logic, he said. But this case wasn't built on logic. It was built on narrative, a performance constructed by people who understood story better than truth. He stood and crossed the room to his writing desk, retrieving a small stack of papers, the sketch of the chessboard, the charcoal portrait, the original gallery schedule. Each piece was misdirection, he said, not meant to mislead police, but to control the story. Greaves wanted to erase Julian and replace him, not with his own name, but with a perfected lie. Every object he left behind was crafted not to conceal the truth, but to frame it. Like a painter choosing which brushstrokes to emphasize, he laid the papers out like puzzle pieces. The chessboard, for example, it wasn't just a cipher. It was a timeline. Each position on the board corresponded to a real-life player, removed in sequence. Maddox, then Venn, then Hartright's withdrawal. It showed not just who was guilty, but how they were removed from the game. Watson frowned. But the painting of you, what was its purpose? Holmes looked at the portrait now hanging beside the fireplace. It was bait. Greaves believed that if I solved the mystery and confirmed his version of events, his authorship would be sealed. But he underestimated his own compulsion. In leaving so many clues to many, he invited scrutiny. Arrogance is the final enemy of deceit. A knock at the door drew both men's attention. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram in her hand. "It's from Lestrade," she said, offering it to Holmes. He took it, read it silently, then passed it to Watson. Greaves escaped during transfer to Belmarsh, disguised as orderly. Warden suspended. Full inquiry underway. Watson swore under his breath. How? He was under constant watch. Holmes didn't appear surprised. He planned it from the beginning. His silence wasn't defeat. It was delay. He knew the public scandal would demand he be moved quietly. No trial, no spectacle, just bureaucracy, and in bureaucracy there are shadows. Watson stared at him. "You let him go." "I let him think he had succeeded," Holmes said. What better punishment for a man obsessed with legacy than to watch his myth unravel in front of him? He walked slowly back to his chair and sat. "Greaves may vanish into the corners of Europe," Holmes said, "but he will not paint again. His work is tainted, his face known. Wherever he runs, he will be nothing more than a ghost with a stolen brush." Watson folded the telegram, expression grim. "Still, I would have preferred justice served." Holmes's gaze flicked toward the fireplace. "So would I. But perhaps justice isn't always the slamming of a cell door. Sometimes it's a silence louder than applause." Outside, London stirred to life once more. Carriages rattled past the window. Boots echoed on the pavement, and the distant bell of St. Mary's told the hour. Watson rose. "And what will you do now, Holmes?" Holmes gave a faint smile, his voice quiet and sure. "Wait. For what?" He looked at the framed sketch on the wall again, the one Julian Maddox had begun of himself. "Never finished, for the next artist who thinks truth can be painted over," Holmes said. "They always come." And with that, the great detective turned once more to his fire, letting the embers glow and crackle, knowing that though the brushstrokes had ended, the canvas of the world would never be blank. The fire had faded to embers by the time silence reclaimed Baker Street. Outside, the fog rolled in thick and slow across the city's veins, muffling the clatter of hooves and the hiss of steam as the last train chugged down the line. Holmes remained still in his chair, one leg crossed over the other, fingers laced. Across his chest in quiet meditation, Watson had long since retired upstairs, the weight of the case finally allowing his mind rest. But Holmes, as ever, was not done. His gaze remained fixed on a single object, one he had moved from the desk and placed beside the hearth earlier that evening. It was a narrow, worn envelope addressed in handwriting too elegant, too precise to be Greaves. It bore no return address, no stamp, only a red wax seal pressed with a symbol Holmes hadn't mentioned to anyone. Upon. Again. Not the one carved into the sculpture Maddox had hidden. Not the scroll that had misled the investigation before. This was older, sharper, and upon breaking it open earlier that day, Holmes had found only a short message. They didn't forge him. They buried him. Follow the ink. not the brush dot at the time. He dismissed it as a final echo of Greaves' deception. But the seal had gnawed at him, not just because of its design, but because of where he'd seen it before. A private exhibit. Years ago, long before Maddox became a name worth whispering. A show of forgotten art from students who never graduated, works attributed to lost hands. Among them, one tiny symbol on the back of a disavowed sketch, the same palm. Holmes sat forward slowly now, struck by a realization that hadn't bloomed until the city had gone quiet. He rose, crossed to his bookshelves, and began searching. Not the shelves of case notes or monographs, but a thin folio tucked behind a row of journals, press clippings from obscure exhibitions. None of them involving theft or murder, but all recorded for reasons even Holmes once didn't fully understand. He found what he was looking for midway through the third volume. An article dated 6 years prior. Title: Echoes of the Forgotten School. The accompanying photograph was faded, but the caption leapt out. Unknown student work, credited to AG, disavowed by Academy. The image was blurry, but Holmes could make out a corner of the canvas. Not the painting itself, but what had been tacked to its side, a scrap of parchment, inscribed with delicate calligraphy. There is no lie more convincing than the one signed by silence. Holmes turned back to the envelope. The seal now bathed in the dying glow of the half dot. If this had come from Greaves, why the riddle? Why the indirect language? Greaves was dramatic. Yes, but he had also been desperate to be understood. This letter held none of his spiteful flourish, none of his desperate hunger for credit. Instead, it felt like a warning. He thought of Lydia Maddox, her fierce clarity in the face of so much shadow. She had brought pieces that completed the puzzle, but only enough to uncover the crime. What if something deeper remained, something neither she nor Greaves had understood? The painting hidden in the Academy's crate had been framed decades ago. Too early, perhaps, for the crime that would come later. So why had Greaves kept it? Holmes stared at the envelope, then at the pawn seal, and for the first time felt the edges of a case he hadn't yet begun. It wasn't over. Greaves had been the killer, yes, but had he truly been the architect, or had he, too, been a piece? He imagined a shadow just out of reach, someone who had studied the players long before the first brushstroke had dried, someone who had chosen Greaves, fed his ego, manipulated his guilt, and perhaps someone who had chosen Holmes as well. A shiver crept up his spine, not from fear, but anticipation. He walked to his desk and took up a fresh sheet of paper. With measured strokes, he began to draft a letter to Lydia, to Lestrade, and to the gallery's new curator. Each would receive a different question, each a different thread. If they frayed, so be it. If they led to something even better. He folded the first sheet, sealed it, and placed it beneath a weight shaped like a raven dot as he stood. A creak from the stair behind him made him turn. Watson, rubbing his eyes, appeared on the landing. "You're still awake," Watson murmured. Holmes nodded. Watson glanced at the fireplace, then at the paper. Case closed. Holmes's eyes twinkled. Only the surface. Watson descended, frowning faintly. "You believe there's more?" Holmes paused. "I believe that every masterpiece casts a second shadow." He said nothing more. Watson, knowing the rhythm of his friend's mind well enough, asked nothing further. He simply sat beside the fire once more and waited. And as the morning light slowly brightened the mist outside, Sherlock Holmes stood again at the edge of another, unknown and new mystery, not born from a crime, but from a whisper in the ashes of resolution. The artist had painted his killer, but who had painted the artist's fate? Holmes smiled faintly, poured himself a fresh cup of tea, and began the quiet wait for the next knock on the door.